Good afternoon. My name is Nuri Turkel. I'd like to begin by saying Ramadan Mubarak. In Uyghur, Ramazan yıllar mübarek olsun. I'm happy to be hosting a series of book talks with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. It is one of my roles that I'm very proud of, serving on the board of the first Uyghur-led research organization devoted to documenting Uyghur human rights and advocating for global policy response. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Luisa Griva, UHRP's Director of Global Advocacy. She has been supporting Uyghur democracy efforts for the last 20 years. I'm happy to count her as one of my closest friends. Most importantly, I'm happy to welcome Amelia Pang. Something that I need to share with how I know her. In 2015, I received an email from her about this future story that she wrote about Ms. Kadir, a Uyghur leader. And almost by accident, back in January, I was reintroduced to the world of Amelia Pang through the op-ed that she wrote in the New York Times. And as you may have seen, the title itself is very telling. It took a genocide for me to remember my Uyghur roots. And I had my second book event. This is my second book event, by the way. Last month, Princeton-based Present Day Clubhouse hosted a book event where I had a chance to discuss the modern-day slavery with Amelia. Amelia's book is tremendously important for the current policy debate in the United States, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Policy, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act being debated now in Congress, as well as in the UK, Canada, Australia, and the European Union, as well as other countries that are trying to come to grips with the state-imposed forced labor, especially the forced labor of Uyghurs. Amelia, congratulations on the publication of your book. Now I would like to ask Luisa to say a few words and set the stage for today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Nuri. Amelia, it's great that you joined us. I know that many Uyghurs are fascinated by your career as a writer, how you managed to research this book. You know, you went to China recently for this, and I know they'll want to hear about it. But the first question I wanted to ask you was something that might surprise people who don't know China so well. You're talking about not just forced labor, but a reform through labor system, right? The RTL system throughout the book. You do refer to hashar, the system of corvée labor, where people come in the Uyghur region, that's a Uyghur term, to work on farms, farm maintenance, road maintenance. So that's your chapter, Laogai Nation, which again is very, very telling. So a lot of people, when they think about forced labor camps, they might think of Stalin and Mao, which is 50, 60 years ago. So what can you tell us about your research and what you found about that this is a 21st century phenomenon in China?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be here with the two of you. So during my research, I found that the issue of forced labor in China is a very long-standing issue. You know, many people may have only recently heard about the so-called vocational training centers, which are the forced labor facilities for Uyghurs and the Uyghur labor transfer program and these things that are getting covered in the news a lot lately, which is great, but this is by far not the only case of forced labor in China. And even in the best case scenario, if we were able to get the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed and ban all goods from the Uyghur region, it would still, I think that the Uyghurs would still be very much at risk for forced labor because there are an infinite amount of, there are just countless number of forced labor facilities throughout China with various names that currently exist and have existed, have always existed ever since the Chinese Communist Party came under power. They all have, similar to the vocational training centers, they have innocent names like drug detox centers, pretrial detention centers, legal education centers. But in many cases, people are arbitrarily detained without due process, without access to a lawyer. And a lot of times they have to do manufacturing work, and they're all, for the most part, working with exporters. So even if China were to close the Uyghur camps, unfortunately, a lot of Uyghurs and other innocent people would very much still be at risk.
I wanted to follow up on that and say, you saw this with your own eyes, right? You spent how much time? You were in Shanghai, and can you tell us how long you were there and how you found these innocent sounding facilities that actually had people locked up and forced to work? And how did you know that they were doing, their products were being exported to the rest of the world?
Yes, so this is not really a secret in the manufacturing industry in China, unfortunately. If you actually go to these sites and talk to the guards and say you're from a Western company that wants to buy products from them, they very much will admit to you that they call it prisoners inside doing manufacturing work, and they can outsource the work, even though that is technically illegal even in China. And if you talk to factory managers, they all acknowledge that this is not really a secret. It's something that's frequently done. They don't even necessarily even see it as a bad thing to the point where they need to hide it. I mean, if you ask about it, it's just the kind of normal part of business. So that was the part that surprised me at how easy it was to actually go there and talk to people, and they will basically admit the connection between forced labor and the exporters.
Amelia, how many prison factories that you were able to visit, and how hard was it for you to find them?
I visited a couple of maybe half a dozen because I repeatedly went to the same ones that that I was able to have a clear hideout spot, and because not all of them were easy to just hang out there and follow trucks from. You needed a certain kind of like parking space available. Some of them are directly in the highway or in the middle of nowhere, and you would kind of really stand out if you stayed there for too long. So there were only a limited number of facilities I could actually repeatedly visit to prove that they were. I wanted to repeatedly visit them to prove that they were, consistently sourcing consistently working with exporters. This wasn't just a one-time deal. And so I visited about half a dozen, and they were not hard to find. A lot of them do have addresses and phone numbers online. If you Google drug detox centers in Chinese, it's a lot of them do have websites and addresses, and in some cases, if you Google the name, there might already be publicity about that particular drug detox center. Maybe a local news station in China was promoting a politician's visit there about how successful their manufacturing facility is there, and you'll see the prisoners inside doing manufacturing work, and sometimes you'll even see the brands they're producing in these pictures. So I think a lot of cases of researchers and if brands themselves want to look, the information's on the internet.
American people just find out about this modern day slavery in the last 15, 16 months in particular. But this has been going on for a long time. I remember back in 2003 that I helped to edit a worker's manual for one of the sneaker makers, American sneaker makers, located in Northeast China. So considering this, ongoing practice, did you learn or did you find out anything about how easy for these products to be exported to the United States and around the world?
It's extremely easy, unfortunately, because the way that the companies are auditing their Chinese suppliers, the audits themselves are very weak and extremely flawed. It is, for the most part, unable to detect these kind of hidden subcontracting to forced labor camps. you know, I've spoken with auditors who have been tasked to do so, and they say during my decades-long work in this industry, I've never been able to prove that a factory is working with a labor camp, but I know it's happening because it is, like I said, in the industry, it's an open secret.
The in relation to, I mean, just to follow up on that, some Western companies, American companies, try to misinform the public, including lawmakers, that the auditing is the way to handle or tackle the forced labor issue. To me, that's lying on its face. That you cannot do auditing or due diligence on people who cannot even comfortably say that they are Muslim or Uyghur. So, what should we? How should we handle this kind of misinformation campaign or misinformation efforts by the global brands here at home?
That's a difficult question because I think it's not even necessarily the misinformation that's confusing legislators, but the money. These brands are putting tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes more, behind lobbying efforts to get the legislators to either not pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or significantly water it down because they can so-called prove that they are doing good audits. As we all know, the Uyghur region, at least, you cannot go and independently verify anything at the moment. And even outside of that region, um, a lot of times the audits, even the very comprehensive ones, are very flawed because they will only check for the conditions inside the factory, but not necessarily for the relationship that that factory may have with a place that is obviously a prison or a labor camp. So the workers, maybe the workers in the regular factory are free, are there on their own will, and are even paid a proper wage with good working conditions. But who is this factory subcontracting to? This is not properly addressed in most audits. I think one change that we need to see is for companies to start tracking the trucks that leave these facilities to see which suppliers they're actually working with. Are they working with the legitimate suppliers that they say they're working with, or are they working with prison camps? That's what I did when I went to China. Was I followed the trucks and saw that clear connection between a lot of forced labor facilities and exporters that major global brands are working with. And if the major global brands are only auditing the official supplier and their working conditions in the legitimate factory, but not what connections that factory has or with camps within their vicinity. Unfortunately, there's so many prison camps in China that there's usually at least some detention centers within the vicinity of most factories. So that's just something that it's not on the radar for a lot of brands. They don't know if their factories are close to any prisons, detention centers, other types of factories that say they're factories, but they're actually associated with the Uyghur labor transfer program. Like, this information is all out there if they want to look for it, but their audits currently do not track any of this.
As you may have seen, this report by South Morning China Post, as well as the policy briefing by US CSIS, that suggests that reports that the export volume to the United States from Xinjiang doubled last year. Why don't American companies stop sourcing prison-made goods and goods made by Uyghur slaves? Isn't it against the U.S. laws to import products made by forced laborers?
It is against US law, and it's a very serious infringement of US law. Unfortunately, Customs and Border Patrol and ICE, they don't have the ability to do in-depth investigations of each company's sourcing practices. You know, they need the way that these laws are enforced at the moment is pretty weak. We need, I think there's certain resources in our government that need more funding, and need policy changes to effectively address the issue. The way it is right now, you know, they're banning one product at a time most of the time. That's extremely tedious process. You have to find a lot of documentation to even ban that one product from that one factory. But a lot of times that same factory can still send other products to the US, despite its history of using forced labor, and that product won't automatically be banned. There's a lot of loopholes in the current US trade laws and enforcement policies that need to be revamped and revisited if we want to fundamentally address this issue. I mean, there's been some progress. I mean, banning all of the cotton products and all of the tomato products from the Uyghur region is definitely a good and better. It's like better to do that than to ban one type of product at a time from one factory. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough because tomatoes and cotton are not the only types of products that the forced laborers make in the Uyghur region, right? We're seeing a lot of reports about significant evidence that the raw materials for solar panels even are made by forced laborers, and you know, it's just that report came out a while ago, and there hasn't been a ban for raw materials for solar panels. It's a very extensive, long process to get something banned if something gets banned. So there needs to be a comprehensive shift, I think, in policy to address it. Otherwise, companies will continue to source from these places because it's cheap. Sometimes it's the only place at the moment that manufactures this type of raw material or product, and that's the only place the company can source from. So it's a complicated issue that requires answers from many different areas of the US government, including investments in US manufacturing. And, you know, I don't think just telling the companies themselves that this area has a lot of forced labor is going to fix the issue.
On that question, do you think that we need more laws and legal tools, or corporate responsibility in the corporate headquarters, more compliance work, cleaning up their supply chain, relocating? Who should bear bigger responsibility? I think, as you point out, the United States government has done its due. They're looking to additional legal measures. But to me, that has to go hand in hand, the legal aspect, legal enforcement, and corporate responsibilities.
Definitely, you need both. I think in terms of corporate responsibility, even just rewriting one part of the auditing requirement could make a big difference, I think. You know, all they have to do would be to edit their current contracts with their Chinese suppliers to say, I may be sending trucks to follow your supplier to see which subcontractors you're working with, to make sure you're not working with any unauthorized subcontractors. You don't even have to actually do it, but just saying that you might do it is going to scare a lot of Chinese factories from being so open or willing to outsource work to prison camps. You know, that's something that wouldn't cost the corporations much money. But there's just a couple of simple things that companies can do to address the issue better. But so far, nobody's actually taking initiative to do that. A lot of people are just saying, oh, but we are conducting audits. Let me show you why my audits are good. There's just a lot of denying, but not actually working together with rights groups or the government to address the issue.
Did the company say that to you? I know you'd write about it in your book, that you did actually contact companies and said, these are my findings. And what kind of responses did you get?
I was very disheartened because they did not seem to be shocked or disturbed by what I found. It was an off-the-record conversation, so I can't say the official company, but I followed one particular truck from a labor camp to a manufacturer that was associated with a big tech company in the US. And when I called that company to tell them that their supplier was sourcing from forced labor, they verified that this was their supplier, indeed, but they said, oh, this supplier works with a lot of different companies. Did you see our product in the truck? How do you know it was our product being made in the labor camp? And I'm saying I'm not saying it was definitely your product being made, but your supplier has a relationship with the forced labor facility. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to be taking any next steps to have a discussion with that supplier to ensure that they know you're very serious about not having them work with forced labor? Even that simple discussion didn't seem to take place. They didn't seem to be willing to do that. They did a simple calculation about how much PR damage would this news be to them, and since they didn't think it would look that bad, since I didn't see their products in the trucks, they decided to essentially do nothing about it, despite knowing this information.
American businesses, as well as some of the global brands that have been profiting in China, told us, the consumers, policymakers, that they have figured out how to do business in China. The recent episode is very telling. The H&M, Nike, the Chinese putting celebrities, including some pretty Uyghur faces in front of TV camera, saying that they love Xinjiang cotton. What does it tell? What do you make of these episodes? And also, do you think in a situation like this, the governments should step in, the European Union, the United States, and others, to show support to those businesses, or that they should left alone and deal with the PRC on their own?
I don't think they should be left alone to deal with the PRC on their own, because I don't feel confident that they will do the ethical choice and put human rights first. It was very disheartening to see the protests in China, the large-scale protests among domestic consumers in China of these brands, because they were quite loud and quite effective, and louder in some ways than any kind of counter protest in the West, opposing the use of Uyghur forced labor. So what that says, that sends a different message to the brands. Instead of, oh, the Western consumers actually are not aware or care about this issue very much, but the Chinese consumers, we could actually lose if we continue to, even on a very cursory level, say that we are against forced labor in Xinjiang. That's all that H&M did. They didn't do anything else. They just said that they were against it. They didn't actually change any of their sourcing practices or move out of factories that were associated with forced labor. So I felt very disheartened by that response in China, and I do think it will require a global policy effort to hold companies accountable. I don't think they would do it on their own, because the bottom line comes first for them.
Yeah, just for the record, I need to remind the participants that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that represents American businesses opposing and lobbying against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Amelia, you've been I understand that you've been speaking with policymakers and government officials in the United States. Can you tell us, as much as you can, what kind of issues that they're interested, and where do you see their policy initiative, future policy initiative, government responses possibly heading to?
I can't share too many details because it was off the record, but I can say that I think there is hope. They are paying attention to the Uyghur forced labor issue, to the broader forced labor issue in general, in a way that they hadn't been a few years ago. When I was first interviewing sources in the government for the book, many of them seemed to have an attitude that this is something that's just beyond their control and they're doing their best, and it's just they cannot do anything until they have enough evidence, and they need multiple different types of evidence to ban even just one product from one factory. Um, it was very hard to get the needle to move forward for any kind of legislation alone related to forced labor. But now you are stating that the tide is starting to shift. There's certain organizations in the government that have more funding now and more resources, and more awareness, and they're definitely working towards figuring out how they can more effectively detect forced labor in the supply chain and keep it out.
Yeah, I am. I have been also in conversation with policymakers, and I'm very delighted that I cannot also disclose the nature of the conversation, but I'm seeing a growing number of members of Congress, in particular, passionately talking about these issues and wanted to address it. In our government system, we have a serious bureaucratic issues as well, problems. And CBP has a very small number of people who investigates potentially forced labor products. It's very small. And also, as a country, we have serious issue that is connected to this, that reportedly there are over 80 critical products that we rely on PRC. That includes PPEs and some of the hospital equipments. So I think the United States government should start with that, and then go on to the list to address the others. I'd like to go back to your wonderful book, Amelia, if I may. There's something very compelling about your book, is the stories of ordinary people. Can you tell us about who Julie is and how she went from being a normal mom in Oregon to being involved in an award-winning documentary film about forced labor goods coming to the United States?
Yes, Julie Keith was an American woman who did not know that forced labor camps existed in China, up until the moment she received a letter from a prisoner who had made her very product. There were these trivial Halloween decorations from Kmart, and that letter changed her life. It really, I think, awakened her to try to avoid products manufactured in China whenever she can. Try to not buy so many trivial things that are likely manufactured in a labor camp, because it was just insanely cheap, and it's hard to say how it could have been ethically made if the product was able to be sold in a store for that cheap of a price. It's heartening to, it is hopeful to see stories like Julie Keith, because I think she was a typical average consumer who was buying a lot of made in China products made by forced labor because she didn't know. She didn't know that this was an issue. And I think there's still people, still average consumers today, who may not know that this is an issue. But we are starting to see more awareness. And I think if more people can be aware of how gruesome and disturbing that the conditions are in these camps, then you're going to start to see a shift where people will not stand for it anymore.
What has been the reception of your book so far, and what kind of questions, particularly, I'm just curious, what is the most interesting question or comment that anyone asked you about the book in your book talks so far?
It's been well received. I'm so grateful for that. The New York Times gave it a good review, and it's such an honor to receive that. Um, a question I get a lot was, will I ever go back to China, and how safe it was. Was it to do reporting? For a while I thought, it wasn't that big of a deal to go because I'm a Chinese, I'm an American, so I had an American passport and I had a lot of protection. But I've recently come to the conclusion that that's actually not the case anymore. Maybe it was never the case. And I do feel a little chilled to read about a lot of the harassment that Vicky Xu has been receiving. The Washington Post did a great article about the Chinese government's high-level targeting of her for her work. A year after, for those who don't know, she's one of the authors of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute report called Uyghurs for Sale, which documents 82 major global brands using Uyghur forced labor. It's a terrific report, very well researched. But when it first came out, of course, the Chinese government denied it and there was some backlash, but I don't think she really felt it doesn't sound like, from what I read of the Washington Post article, that she felt a huge threat until now, a year later. There's a coordinated effort in the Chinese government to target her now due to the rising number of governments around the world who are criticizing the Uyghur forced labor issue in China. That does, I think, make the situation more dangerous for journalists and researchers who are writing about the issue. I mean, the level of attacks in domestic Chinese papers and also on even Western social media, it's really it really can be intense in a way that I hadn't mentally or emotionally prepared for.
Actually, two of Nuri's fellow commissioners, right, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, were sanctioned by the Chinese government for speaking up on Uyghur human rights.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Louisa. It's a sign of, it shows how desperate that they are. The irony is that the people that they have sanctioned here at home and Europe and Canada are the people who are defending human rights and civil liberties, whereas the people in China who have been sanctioned for criminal acts, criminal intentions. So that's the difference. Before we move on to the part about your personal story, I wanted to mention a couple of things. One, Vicky Xu, Louisa and I had a chance to spend some time with her when she was in Washington. And something what she told us was fascinating and very, very compelling. She said that I was trained to hate the Uyghurs when I was in China. And now I am fighting for their rights. And this fighting for the Uyghur rights work has been very costly for her. I encourage you to follow and pay attention to her stories. China is literally picking a fight with Vicky Xu and other courageous women who's been telling the truth. I want to mention also a support of the Forced Labor Prevention Act. UHRP is actively campaigning on this issue, and we urge listeners to call the senators if they haven't done so, to ask them to co-sponsor the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You can refer to it as S65. I think the staff will put a like a to take action page in the comments, so you can use that. Talking about your personal story, that I find it incredibly compelling, especially after reading the New York Times op-ed. What was your impression of what Uyghurs were like when you were growing up? with only the Chinese side of your identity recognized in the family?
Yes, so as many of you may know, my grandmother was half Uyghur, and she actually was born and raised in Urumqi, and she had knowledge of the Uyghur language and culture and traditions, but within one generation that was kind of lost. It wasn't really passed down to my mother or her siblings, and so growing up, I was always just told that grandmother was Uyghur, and the Uyghurs are an ethnic minority in China. And as a child, I asked them, what is an ethnic minority? What does that mean? Are the Uyghurs a different race? Are they not Chinese? And they said, no, the Uyghurs are Chinese. So that was very confusing as a child, because I did not necessarily think of the Uyghurs or our Uyghur heritage as something separate from the Chinese heritage or identity. I did not understand what the term ethnic minority meant in China. The term doesn't really exist in the US. Only in very recent years did I realize, and actually, unfortunately, very, very recently did I realize how harmful the term ethnic minority even is and how inaccurate it is. Actually, it was an activist on Twitter that pointed out, it's not really historically accurate to say the Uyghurs are ethnic minorities in China. Right? They're, according to historians like Ri and Thum, the Uyghurs are indigenous people of Central Asia, and I think if I had been told that from the beginning, I would have had a very different understanding of who the Uyghurs are and what the culture, and a very different kind of interest in this separate and different group that is not Chinese. It wouldn't have taken me so long to realize, oh, there's this whole big part of our heritage that has been ignored for pretty ominous reasons.
Amelia, your op-ed is amazing. I read it late at night. I read it twice. I didn't expect to read something like that. It was very revealing and a powerful piece that you wrote. What prompted you to write that op-ed in the New York Times?
It was something I've been thinking about for a very long time before I wrote it. And I'm so glad you actually brought up the Rabia Kadir article initially, and from 2015. Rabia Kadir was actually the first Uyghur I'd ever met in my life, or the first person who had identified as a Uyghur, and so proudly identified it, and told me for the first time that the Uyghurs are a different group. We're not Chinese, and you need to be aware of your Uyghur heritage. She actually, I didn't have enough word count in the Times article to include this story, but the Rabia Kadir, when I first met her, she said to me, "You're a Uyghur. You look like a Uyghur. Like, I have the Uyghur nose. I think in the summertime, if I'm in the sun a lot, I get quite tan really easily. And she said, it's a shame that you don't know the Uyghur language, and you should learn more about it." And it's something that it was eye-opening to hear that for the first time, to hear that, hey, you're not Chinese. And it kind of, although I didn't think about it at the time, it did make sense, because looking at her, I did feel like I looked more like her than I did. Maybe I shared more physical character traits with her, physical, like facial traits with her than the typical maybe Han Chinese person that I encountered in the US. When I was growing up in the US, a lot of Chinese Americans, you go to Chinese school on Sundays. It's it's not religious or political. It's just the organization to help Chinese Americans learn Mandarin and learn something about the Chinese culture and keep the language alive for the kids. And so on Sundays, I would spend the entire day with 100% Han Chinese or Taiwanese people and kids. And I always felt like such an outsider, and I never really understood why. I didn't understand why at the time. I just looked different from them. You know, my hair was different. You know, I actually straightened it today because it can get really puffy. But I do have really wavy hair when it's not straightened. That's, you know, a typical Uyghur trait, but not very typical in East Asian people. I was always a lot darker than a lot tanner than a lot of my Chinese American peers. I had a very different nose from them. Like, it was just, although I'm only technically 1/8 Uyghur, I think the Uyghur gene is a really strong one. Even if you just are mixed with a little bit of Uyghur, you do tend to have certain traits that become the dominant trait in you. And you know, what can I say? It just made sense. It finally made sense when she said that to me, that the Uyghurs are not Chinese, because, you know, they aren't. They're an entirely different people. But in terms of the New York Times article, I think it was really when we started hearing more news about the camps and the scale of the detentions, the numbers I realized that there's a darker part to my family's forced assimilation story, and it just needed to be told and addressed.
Your op-ed has such a striking title about forgetting your Uyghur roots. If I may, I'd like to read some powerful lines from your piece. To my Uyghur family, I am sorry I never knew you. I am sorry I never tried to search for you when I had a chance. I am sorry it took a full pledge, genocide, for me to remember I am Uyghur. This is just 3 short sentences, but it tells a whole story of assimilation, doesn't it?
Yes, that was my feeling when I first saw the pictures of the detainees in these camps, and how much I looked like them, a lot more than the Chinese American peers that I had grown up with and thought that I was a part of, and how this entire group that is essentially being detained in different types of camps at the moment. And there's no way for me to reach my family members that are most likely in camps like that. Now, I could have, had I taken an interest maybe and tried to reach out to people, and maybe a Kadir first mentioned to me in 2015 that I should. And I'm so sorry that I didn't, because now it's too late. And even if I were to find out the names of my relatives and their situations, I don't know if I should even say anything, because I don't know if that would help them or bring them more danger, since I'm now being targeted, like by the Global Times wrote an article slamming my book. And right now, after completion of this book, I don't even know if it will help at this point to reach out to anyone. But I'm sorry that I never got to know them or build that relationship before it was too late.
I have one final question before we move on to the Q&A session. What kind of responses that you're getting on your op-ed?
Really good responses for the most part. At least from the Uyghurs, really good responses. some white people were saying that I was using the Uyghurs prominent name at the moment to make myself famous, claiming myself to
That's not
be
fair.
claiming to be like pulling Elizabeth Warren, using the Native American term to win. I don't know, like, and I just felt like, you know, it's not white people's place to say that. You know, it's not their place to comment. If the Uyghurs feel that way, you can say that, and that's totally legitimate. But yeah, no, I haven't. And if the Uyghurs do feel that way, that's fine. You can say it. But that was something that was annoying that came up on Twitter.
Thank you so much. We can go on and on, but this is very interesting, enlightening conversation. But we should give a chance to the participants to ask questions. They can write their questions in the chat box, I think. Luis, are you reading any questions?
There is one question so far, but absolutely, if people have topics or comments for Amelia, they're very welcome to write in the chat. But this question is, what made you decide to become a writer? The stereotype is, you know, some Chinese American families, you know, don't really encourage their children to become writers, especially the way you did your writing. So I want to tell one story that I know about what you did, because it was a freelance article you did. You went undercover in New York Times Chinatown and basically sold yourself into a trafficking system to work in like a restaurant or nightclub. So that seems really dangerous. So tell us the story and tell us how you decided to become a writer and how you're, you know, how that came about.
Thank you. That sounds more dramatic, I think, than what it actually was. So that was an undercover story about the exploitative employment agencies in New York. You know, a lot of times, if an undocumented Chinese immigrant comes to the US and they don't have a job, or they owe a lot of money to the snakehead that they paid tens of thousands of dollars to sneak them in, they're really desperate and they'll go through an employment agency, which is this private company. They'll pay them lots of money to find them a really terrible job. And so I went to one of these employment agencies and I said, I was looking for a job. I need you to help me. And they basically charged me like $60 to find me a restaurant job in Georgia. And it was a Chinese buffet in Georgia. And they shipped me the mail. They bussed me there, and basically the buffet owner, once you got there, said, "Oh, you know, you can stay at this dormitory, which is a house that some of the local restaurant owners bought together to house their workers. And we won't pay you, but you can stay at this house for free, and you can take whatever tips you make at the restaurant." And that, unfortunately, is the reality for a lot of immigrants who are in this situation. And nobody has really written about it because they haven't been able to go inside to document it. So I don't think I was personally my life was at risk at any point during that investigation, but it was really eye-opening to do that. And I think I wouldn't have been able to get the information that I did had I not actually applied for a job at that employment agency. So that's a little bit more about what I write about and how I started my writing career. Yeah, my parents don't really approve of what I write about, but you know, that's nothing they can do about that.
But every parent is proud of a child who writes a book. So again, congratulations. And we hope viewers will take a look and you know, feel proud of your accomplishment, where again, you really, it wasn't a desk research. You went out and you talked to people. You traveled to China and you did things that could have gotten you in a lot of trouble if the local authorities figured out what you were going to write about. And maybe you know, threatened you or made it very, very difficult for you to continue your work. So hats off to that. So we have a question here. What, after you learned that you're Uyghur, you have Uyghur roots, have you been able to reconnect with those roots? Obviously in COVID, so much is online, but have you been able to, what areas of Uyghur culture, history, and life have you been able to reconnect to, and what part of that is most meaningful to you?
Actually, I connected with the Tarim Network, which is a great group of Uyghurs who are really working to keep the Uyghur tradition and language and alive. And they actually offer free Uyghur classes for anybody who wants to take them. And I unfortunately didn't finish the course because there's a couple things going on in my personal life and I just got too busy. But I was taking Elshat's class, which was pretty terrific. I don't know if anybody listening knows him. And he was just, he was a great teacher because he didn't just teach you the words and the grammar and the pronunciation. He also taught you a lot about the Uyghur culture. I really enjoyed learning about the Uyghur New Year, which is in spring, and how you eat green dumplings that are the material for that is made of alfalfa. I think that helps make that green color to celebrate the spring, and how traditionally in the Uyghur region you might have in certain regions you might have wrestling matches to celebrate New Year. It's just fun things that I would love to see one day in person. One of these New Year wrestling matches. I really hope the day will come when we can go to Uyghur land to enjoy a festival like that.
Amelia, I have there's another question. Has there been any reaction from your Chinese friends after publishing of your book and acknowledgement of your Uyghur root?
That's a really great question. I think for the friends who have a different perspective than we do, maybe have not said anything, but actually there's a lot of them who are very, very supportive. A lot of Chinese Americans who are very supportive of the Uyghurs. And I wanted to bring up the topic about maybe forming some kind of reconciliation between the Chinese and the Uyghurs, outside of China at least. I think, understandably, a lot of Uyghurs have a lot of resentment and mistrust towards anybody that's of Han Chinese descent. And of course, there are a large number of them, especially ones who have recently left China, or maybe the older people who have grown up in China their entire lives. They do harbor very, very ill thoughts and wishes towards Uyghurs, but there's also a significant number of Chinese Americans who, if you grew up in the U.S., you are very supportive of the various groups in China that are undergoing persecution, especially the Uyghurs. And I think there's a lot of room for there's a lot more room for alliances to be built between the two groups, and hopefully we can see more of that.
Great. I have a one follow-up question. This is from me. I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to learn more from you. In January, the Chinese government issued countermeasures aimed at countering U.S. sanctions against Chinese companies. And the Chinese company now could sue foreign companies that side with the U.S. sanctions against China. So in light of, in the face of this mounting pressure, do you think that the Western companies, particularly the ones that have been implicated, were reported in Vicky Shu's report and others' report, should leave China completely?
I personally think they should, but I don't think they will, because unless there's some kind of a policy made to address this, they're going to try to appease the Chinese domestic consumers as much as possible, because it's such a big market for them. That's, I think, the reason why, a year after the Australian Strategic Policy Institute report came out, not everyone is pulled out of China. Not everyone has even disowned the factory that is known to be using Uyghur forced labor, because they just don't want to offend that Chinese market. It's such a delicate relationship for an important relationship for them. And unless there's some kind of, I think it will take U.S. legislation, unfortunately, to force them to be more accountable. Or on the other side of the coin, it would take louder voices on the Western consumer side to push our companies to be more accountable. Right now, you're not seeing, I'm disappointed to say, there's not a whole lot of pushback from global consumers about the usage of Uyghur forced labor. So companies are noting that and paying more attention to the financial threats they're receiving in China.
Over to you, Louisa, if you have any final thoughts before we close.
Yes. Well, I'm really glad you mentioned consumer campaigns, because there are some. I really want to give a shout out to some student groups that have gotten together and actually marking Ramadan and saying, let's have a 30-day fast from the brands that have not said anything or have, worse, become fashion cowards and given in to the Chinese government's manufactured consumer outrage. So I urge people to follow Free Uyghur Now on Instagram, as well as Stand Now, a national student group, and their campaign. So it's sort of, they're looking for people to make that pledge. And speaking of Ramadan, it is a time to think about the poor and unfortunate, people who are in need. And so certainly Uyghur Human Rights Project has been the beneficiary of a fundraising campaign on Launch Good. And so we urge people to look for that and use this opportunity to support the human rights work, advocate for all the suffering people, whether they're Uyghurs in the Uyghur region, in the homeland of East Turkestan, and some refugees. So these are all things that it's good to think about now at this time, both putting pressure on the companies that are acquiescing and also directly helping Uyghurs. So thanks for that opportunity. And I do have one question, which is people want to follow your career, Amelia. So they want to know what's coming next. And I think you probably still have a lot of book talks yet coming before you can turn your pen or your keyboard to a new topic. Is that right?
Yes, I'm not ready to move on from this one yet, but I appreciate the follow.
That's right. We've had one or two people just saying that because of this talk, they're absolutely can't wait to look at the book. So that's support from our viewers.
Thank you.
Amelia, this is a great opportunity for not only for us, but the Uyghur community to learn about your amazing work. I have a recommendation. I'm just holding this book, Made in China. I'd like you to go to Amazon and purchase this book right now. The support of Amelia's amazing work. Just going to China to research for this book itself is a very, very risky business. And I'm sure that there's more backlash than the global times that this book writing has caused. So please go to Amazon and buy this book, Made in China, A Prisoner and SOS Letter, The Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. Thank you very much. With this, I wanted to thank everyone and happy Ramadan again. I look forward to our next book event.
Rahmat, everyone. Ramadan Mubarak.
Rahmat.